Thank you, Edward, for such an eloquent introduction, reminding me of some of my writings as well. When I was listening to a message sent to us by Elie Wiesel, I couldn't help but thinking how similar and how different our experiences are. In a way, it is the same experience of oppression, of suffering, of witnessing your friends and relatives being killed, of knowing how many millions of people are being executed or starved to death. And yet there were some significant differences. Yes, we also experienced a certain element of indifference in the world, but probably thanks to efforts of the previous generation, the people like Elie Wiesel and others, the world was more sensitive to what's happening in our time. We did feel solidarity of the world. And if I was later expelled from the Soviet Union, from my prison cell to the West, that was mostly due to those people in the West who were tirelessly campaigning on my behalf and on behalf of many others. I've just met one of these people here in Oslo again, my old friend Leif Hovilsen, who himself, a participant in the wartime resistance in Norway, an inmate of concentration camp, someone who was subjected by torture by Gestapo, was campaigning on our behalf when we were in jail. So somehow the torch of sympathy and solidarity was passed on from the wartime to our time, and hopefully from our time to the next generation. Yes, our experiences are similar and yet different. Elie Wiesel and his mates were victims, just victims. I honestly object to anyone who describes me as a victim. I'm not a victim. I'm a soldier. I knew perfectly well what expects me when at the age of 16, I decided I'm not going to accept this regime, no matter what. I knew perfectly well what will happen and actually expected the worst. So naming myself a victim would be kind of insulting. And I'm sure many of my colleagues here in this hall who came from all over the world, from other countries where they were fighting for human rights and human dignity would say the same. We are the new breed. We are not victims. So there is improvement in this world. There is more solidarity, and there is more fighting back. There is so much difference as well with our experiences. If Elie Wiesel, at the end of his life, can say that he can forgive people who caused so much harm to his nation, to his friends and inmates, I cannot say that in all honesty. No one has yet asked my forgiveness. Those who perpetrated all these horrible crimes in the communist countries are safely in power again. These people had never said sorry. Those and those of their accomplices in the West who were apologists and sympathizers of the Soviet oppression throughout all these decades, they're still in position of power. They never said sorry, and therefore never gave us a chance to forgive them. This year marks 20th anniversary of those spectacular events which brought down the communist regimes across Eastern and Central Europe. In itself, it was a magnificent turning point in our history, a moment for which many of us worked all our life. Naturally, these spectacular events were greeted by the world with some kind of euphoria. It was quickly proclaimed to be the end of history, the end of Cold War, the end of communism. Very optimistic prognosis. And yet, 20 years down the road, all we can do is to repeat the famous phrase of Mark Twain, that the rumors of its death are greatly exaggerated. In China and Cuba, in North Korea and in Vietnam, people are still living in the very same nightmare in which we lived. expecting every moment to be dragged to their version of Gulag, or praying for their friends and relatives who are already there. For other nations which have just emerged from their totalitarian past, this past is still a present because they still live in the shadow of it. So far, no former communist country has managed to transcend its experience of the past. And their life is marked by its past, by its horrors, pretty much like a face of a smallpox victim would be marked forever. We can see these marks in their public life, in their political system, in their business ethics, in their attitudes, psychological attitudes to life. Yet other nations are already marching backwards. In Russia, in Belarus, in some former Central Asian republics, or in Nicaragua, restoring the old regime is in full progress. Democratic institutions are systematically destroyed or dismantled. Elections turned into the farce. Political repressions are everyday reality again. And even some new countries joined that sad list of tyrannies and repressive societies, such as Venezuela. But looking at the West, you understand that the consequences of these decades of communist tyranny and the lack of resistance to it are even more profound. Contrary to one's expectations, the collapse of communist regimes in the East did not bring to any sobriety in the West, to reassessment of its behavior and its past, reassessment of its values. Just as we speak, a new version of the Soviet Union is forced on a sullen majority of European nations, the European Union. Admittedly, it's a very pale copy, very mild copy of former Soviet Union, and yet the copy nonetheless. We are already told that there will be a Europolice, a Europol, some kind of a version of KGB in the European Union, which would be policing us on 32 counts of crimes, 2 of which are particularly interesting because they don't exist as a crime in the penal code of any nation. That's crime of racism and crime of xenophobia. And we already explained that those of us who object to the immigration policies of European unions are going to be charged with the crime of racism, and those of us who object to European Union are going to be charged with the crime of xenophobia. Well, it always pays to know the article under which you're going to serve in jail. Just as we speak, under the pressure of Brussels, the European nations are hastily introducing a new law on hate speech, somewhat Orwellian thing, which, as Orwell once predicted, would make some animals more equal than others. Under this law, which is direct infringement on our freedom of speech, only specific hates are going to be punished. And those of us who hate what is prescribed are safe. Just as we speak, the countries of the Western Europe becomes more and more protective, unnecessary protective, trying to save us from ourselves. I'm constantly reminded about that whenever I smoke. When can I read on a pack of cigarettes a very touching inscription, "Smokers die young." Bearing in mind that I smoked for 52 years, that's a very touching reminder. I wonder how young I'm going to be when I die. So what happened? Why such a spectacular events of 20 years ago? Such a spectacular successes in dismantling the gulags in Eastern and Central Europe could not bring us the better results. Why suddenly it stopped? It got delayed. Well, our common tragedy is that communism was never defeated conclusively, unlike its brown brother. It was never put on trial. We had never had any process of decommunization, unlike the denazification process in Germany. The result is predictable. Just imagine what would have happened if Victoria's allies in 1946 would not demand unconditional surrender from Nazi Germany, but would be satisfied with some kind of perestroika of that regime. Surely most of the countries of Europe formerly occupied by Nazi Germany would have never attained democracy. They would have lived under what is now very nicely termed post-totalitarian society. Surely, in few years, and under different name, the National Socialist Workers' Party would have come to power in Germany again, introducing somewhat milder version of their own Nazism. This is what would have happened if our fathers and grandfathers were not wise enough to insist on unconditional surrender. And this is exactly what happened in the years after 1989, precisely because that surrender was never demanded. I remember many of my colleagues and myself were trying to persuade the Russian government of the time in 1991-92 that it's our obligation to put the communist regime on trial in Moscow, on trial of the Nuremberg type, where they could be accused of all the crimes they committed, where all their dirty secrets could be made public and discussed and judged. We failed. Quite understandably, because those whom we addressed to, the government of Russia of the day, they all belonged to former communist nomenclatura one way or another, and they did understand that if such a process started, they would not have place in political life within few years. But also, the reason was much deeper, because the Western countries also were reluctant to allow this kind of process. We were told that we are trying to start to mount a witch hunt. Well, today the witches returned and they're hunting us. Using that moment, and after initial period of shock, the Communist Party nomenclatura revived and slowly but surely was returning to power, which they achieved in the year of 2000, when the worst part of the communist nomenclatura, the KGB, took over. What followed, you all know. The former Soviet Union is in the process of being reborn again, with the new assertiveness of Russian regime, with new bullying and aggression toward the neighboring countries, with the return of imprisonment, return even of psychiatric abuse in Russia. Unfortunately, and the most regrettably, this turn of events was very easily absorbed by the population in Russia. They quite easily returned back to their habitual state of servility, to their self-censorship, to their false optimism, exactly the things I remember in my childhood, which made life in the Soviet Union so revolting. But why is the West so adamantly opposed to what we suggested? Why was it so important? A year later, in 1992, when the Communist Party in the Soviet Union revived sufficiently to go into attack and to sue Yeltsin in the Constitutional Court of Russia, I was serving in that court as an expert on the presidential side. In that capacity, I had access to the secret archives of Central Committee and Politburo. And what I've discovered there explain to me why the West was so adamantly against the Nuremberg trial in Moscow. To begin with, so many of the prominent figures of the Western political, business, cultural world were in a secret collaboration with Moscow that it would have been a huge shock in the West if that was revealed. And no one wanted that shock. But much more importantly, it would have been an ideological shock. Throughout the end of the Soviet Union, according to the documents I've seen, numerous leaders of the political establishment of the West, particularly of the left-wing spectrum, would come to Russia, to the Soviet Union, alarmed by the prospect of a collapse of the Soviet Union. Now think of that. We worked all our life to see that collapse. And in a crucial moment, when it was about to collapse, the entire world was trying to save it. And what was the explanation? Why was it so adamant to support this disintegrating regime? Oh, because, as they say, and I quote, collapse of socialism in the East can bring the crisis to that idea in the West. So what they were trying to save is their own illusion, their own utopias of socialism, by dooming our countries into a very painful transition in doing so. What would have Moscow trials revealed? First of all, it would have shown to the world without any doubt that socialism means endless lines to empty stores, destruction of culture, poverty, miserable way of life, and ultimately Gulag. What would have shown to the world if it was honestly, clearly shown? It would have shown, above all, that there is any utopia, no matter how good intentions are of those who propagate it, would ultimately lead you to bloodbath, to Gulag, and above all, that anyone who is trying to force one's dream and utopia onto the people without their explicit consent are committing a crime. That, we all hoped, would have become the knowledge of the world, the legacy of a communist regime. Because if the world doesn't make any lessons out of the horrible existence of several decades in the communist countries, then the whole tragedy is meaningless. It would have no meaning than a gigantic earthquake. We have to make that lesson out of that experience. Pretty much like the Nuremberg trials in Germany have shown to the world that certain concepts are unacceptable for our civilization, such as racism and eugenics. Pretty much the same would have happened if the trials in Moscow were allowed to go. That the concepts of social engineering, of political brainwashing, is criminal, and it should not be allowed anymore. The mankind would have been enriched as a result of our bitter experience. But should we say that everything is lost? Not at all. I think we gained, as a result of that experience, enormous things. And when I'm saying that, I have in my mind a picture, which I'm sure most of you have seen. 20 years ago, during the demonstrations in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, this famous sequence of a single student standing on the way of a tank column and stopping it. And I remember watching it on television, and I knew exactly what this man is thinking, because that's, symbolically speaking, this is exactly what we were doing, standing on the way of huge, rusty, totalitarian machine. And the thought is very simple. You want to kill me if you have guts, but do it publicly. Do it in front of the whole world. And the tanks stopped. This precious gift we've got from the years of hardship, of fighting, of despair, the gift of knowledge that we have free will, that no one can take it away from us. and therefore we have an obligation to exercise it. This gift no one can take from us. And when the next stage of this inevitable development comes, when the communist regimes will start to collapse in China and Cuba, in Vietnam and in North Korea, I want my colleagues in these countries to remember this experience and to be much, much firmer than we were, to demand unconditional surrender from our enemy and to put them on trial. Thank you.